Dead Man's Shadow. This is, of course, in the Haunted Teacher's True Ghost Stories book. Dead Man's Shadow. The horrible vision appeared without warning. Sixth grade teacher Mike Kerr was discussing grammar with his class when he developed a headache. It started out as a dull pain in the back of his neck and crept its way up and over his skull before sliding down his forehead. Suddenly, an image began to appear in his mind, and gradually it came into focus until he saw it in vivid and frightening detail. The anguished face of a bearded man, a man hanging from a rope around his neck. Mike closed his eyes, but the appalling mental picture remained as clear as if he were staring at the man in real life. The vision lasted about 10 seconds before it faded away, leaving Mike so jolted that he had to lean against his desk to keep from falling. Mr. Kerr, Mr. Kerr, called out Stacy Reingold, one of the students. Are you all right? I'm sorry, class, mumbled the teacher. I'm not feeling well. I have a splitting headache. Turn to chapter 10 and start reading. I'll be right back. He staggered to the bathroom, looked in the mirror, and saw that all the color had gone out of his cheeks. He splashed cold water on his face and shook his head. What was that all about? He wondered. What just happened to me? Mike Kerr was enjoying his first year of teaching sixth grade at Reynolds Elementary. It was challenging but rewarding because he had a good group of students. Besides, he was living in his favorite locale in the beautiful foothills of Virginia. His parents had been raised there before they moved to Massachusetts, where Mike grew up. By early spring, Mike had become one of the most popular teachers in school. Shortly before his 30th birthday, he joked with his students that they could shower him with gifts, ones that cost no money, to cheer him up because he was starting to feel old. On the morning of Mike's birthday, student Todd Fisher arrived in school with what he thought was the greatest present for his teacher. Todd wasn't the best student. He was lucky if he pulled B's and C's, and he tried, maybe not hard enough, but at least he made the effort. He was a good kid who stayed out of trouble and displayed a great sense of humor. Here, Mr. Kerr, this is for you, said Todd, beaming. And then he placed an old, chipped, dusty brick on the teacher's desk. Happy birthday. Thank you, Todd, said Mike as he picked up the brick. What is it? It's a brick. Yeah, I know it's a brick. Does it have any significance, or does it symbolize my effectiveness as a teacher? No, what I'm trying to say is it does have some significance. My dad owns a demolition company, and this brick comes from the very first schoolhouse here in Rockton. My dad tore it down last year. I thought maybe since your kinfolk probably went to that school, you'd like to have a brick from it. Maybe use it as a paperweight or something. I took one for myself, and I keep it in my room. Mike lifted the brick and turned it gently in his hand, and he looked at Todd and smiled. Well, this is a wonderful gift, Todd. Thanks. I'll keep it here on my desk to hold down all the A-plus homework I'll be getting from you. A feather paperweight would work just as well for the number of A-pluses I get in homework. Mike laughed and gently placed the brick near one of the corner of his desk. Other students brought their teacher presents, including homemade cookies or a set of baseball cards. It seemed as if this was going to be a wonderful birthday, until the vision appeared. Mike tried to forget about it, but he couldn't. That's because that same headache, followed by the same intense vision, struck him every day for a week. It would hit without warning while working a math problem on the blackboard, or calling on a student, or inserting a video in the VCR for a science film. Day after day, the mental snapshot would flash in his brain, remain for several seconds, and then vanish. Mike needed all the concentration he could muster to get him through the day without cracking. But the strain was beginning to show. I don't get it, he told himself. I'm not under any stress. I'm in excellent health. So why am I getting these headaches? Why this particular vision? What does it mean? How do I make it stay away? Mike was in the middle of an astronomy class when the latest vision appeared. Imagine that, just all of a sudden this appears in your mind of somebody hanging. Excuse me, class, he said, turning away from them so they wouldn't see him grimace. Once the vision faded away, he faced the students again. Now then, where was I? Oh, yes. Who can name in order the two planets between the Earth and the Sun? Todd? What, me? Squealed Todd. Mike took a look at the sheer terror spreading across the student's face. The boy gulped and broke out in a cold sweat. This was not a difficult question. Even if it was, it shouldn't have caused such a reaction in Todd. Todd, are you all right? Asked the teacher. Mr. Kerr, I don't feel well. May I have an excuse so I can go to the bathroom? Sure, Todd. At the end of the day, Mike asked Todd to stay after school. Is something wrong, Todd? I've noticed these last few days that you seem, preoccupied. Is something on your mind? Is everything okay at home? Things are cool at home, Mr. Kerr. I guess I must be coming down with the flu. I've been getting a lot of headaches lately. Me too, Todd. Still, you looked scared today when I asked you a question in class. That's not like you, even when you don't know the answer. Todd lowered his head and didn't say a word, and his eyes welled up with tears. Mr. Kerr, I think I need some help. I think I'm sick in the head. Mike led the student to a desk, and they both sat down. What is wrong, Todd? I've been seeing things in my mind, bad things. Every day a picture pops into my mind. It's awful. It's of a man hanging from a rope by his neck. Mike sat stunned. This is incredible. Poor Todd is seeing it too. The teacher leaned forward and asked, "Does this man have a beard?" "Yeah, he did. How'd you know that?" "I'm not sure. Don't reveal too much yet," Mike told himself. "You don't want to scare Todd. His vision and mine must be connected in some manner. I wonder if other kids in the class are seeing the same thing, although they don't act like they do." "Am I going crazy, Mr. Kerr?" "No, Todd. There has to be an explanation. I'll help you get to the bottom of this." "You won't tell anyone, will you? I mean, otherwise they're going to think I'm nuts." "I'll keep it quiet. When did you first start seeing this vision?" "About a week ago." "That's when mine started," thought Mike. "What is the connection? Todd, did anything happen back then? Anything unusual you can recall?" "No. I mean, baseball practice started, but I didn't get hit in the head with a ball or anything like that." Mike walked over to his desk and looked at the calendar from the previous week. He picked up the brick and moved it to get a better look. Teachers meeting on Monday night, base basketball Tuesday night, birthday on Wednesday, date with Jan on Friday night. Todd, try to remember exactly when you first saw the vision. "Well, I was riding my bike home from my dad's office. I had stuffed a couple of bricks from the old school in my backpack when I first saw that man in my mind." Mike looked at the back of the calendar. The brick. Todd gave me a brick the next day on my birthday, the first day I started to see that terrible image. "Todd, let me investigate this matter. I don't understand why you should suffer from this vision, but I promise I'm going to try to put an end to it." "Thanks, Mr. Kerr. I don't want to see this man anymore. It's too scary." After Todd left, Mike picked up the brick and held it in his hands. He examined all 6 sides. Of flecks of red chips and dust came off in his hands. The side that had been exposed to the elements had several coats of paint in it. For an instant, Mike thought that side felt warmer than the others, like it was giving off energy. Suddenly, like a bolt, Mike was hit again with the vision of a hanged man. This time it was more intense than ever. The man's bloodshot eyes seemed so big and full of terror, anger, and despair. The image remained seared in his mind several seconds longer than usual, and it did not start to fade until Mike let go of the brick, which then fell with a thud on top of his desk. "It's got to be the brick," Mike exclaimed to himself. He drove straight to Fisher Demolition, the firm owned by Todd's dad, Art Harvey. Mike had no idea what he was going to say or learn. He just knew he had to go there. After exchanging pleasantries with Harvey in the company office, Mike told him, "Your son was thoughtful enough to give me a birthday present, a brick from the old schoolhouse you tore down." "That's my boy, always trying to butter up the teacher," Harvey said with a laugh. "I'm just joshing you, Mr. Kerr, so what do you want, more bricks?" "No, I would just like some information. Were the bricks used for anything after the school was torn down?" "No, we just dumped them out back for use later as fill. Some people who had gone to that school took a brick as a memento. I probably should have sold the bricks to them, but what the heck, I'm a nice guy." "This is going to sound really weird, Mr. Fisher, but I was wondering if there's any kind of link between the bricks from the schoolhouse and the hanging of a man." "Well, there sure as shooting is." "What?" Mike gasped, squeezing the arm of his chair. "There was?" "Well, yeah. Haven't you heard about the dead man's shadow?" Mike shook his head. "Well, gosh, everybody in town knows about that. It's the strangest thing that ever happened here in Rockton. And you didn't know, huh? I guess that's because you're kind of new to the area, although you have kin who were raised here and—" "Mr. Fisher, please," said Mike. "I've got to know. What is the story?" "Let's grab us a soda and sit outside a spell, and I'll tell you all about the dead man's shadow." In 1875, Del Kincaid, a bearded, husky mountain of a man, became the area's first male teacher. The men in town couldn't figure out why this burly 6'4", 220-pound former lumberjack would want to be a school teacher. But they didn't dare kid him to his face because Kincaid had a quick temper and he was not afraid to unleash it. In school, he demanded the kids sit up in their chairs, address him as sir, stay quiet in class, and do all their homework. He wouldn't put up with any antics or excuses, and if they behaved, he rewarded them with extra playtime and cookies that his girlfriend would make. If they misbehaved, he made them stand in the corner for an hour. If they were really bad, he ordered them to clean the outhouse behind the school. You know, that'd be like the toilet was outside of the school back then, and it was a little hole in the ground, and you had to clean it if you were in trouble. Only one boy, Randall Turnipseed, ever received the outhouse punishment twice. He and Kincaid were at odds throughout the youth's years in school. The two never got along. Randall complained that the teacher had it in for me from the get-go. Kincaid claimed that the boy was incorrigible, a disruptive influence on the others. For the most part, the parents liked Kincaid at the job he was doing instructing their children, and the kids respected him. Over summer vacation in 1880, the teacher took a job helping the local blacksmith. And one day, a miner named Tom Worthy, one of the roughest men in town, complained to Kincaid about a job he did shoeing Tom's horse. Do you know that a blacksmith, which is what another job he had, they would melt metal and make it in a fire, and they would make maybe like horseshoes that go underneath the horse's foot, and they would bend metal. I don't know if you've ever seen a blacksmith's place before, but they have a fire going and they melt metal and they make things out of it. So that's one thing he did besides being a teacher. Well, this man did not like the horseshoe that he made for his horse. One word led to another, and Worthy, who was about Kincaid's size, sucker punched the teacher, knocking him down. Kincaid got up, but when he noticed that two of his students outside were watching him, he put down his fists and dusted himself off. Clearly, the teacher was fuming mad, but he held his anger because of the boys. Turning to them, he said, "Fighting might end a conversation, but it doesn't solve anything. I will resolve this matter my own way. Now go on, boys, scat." Well, Tom Worthy, the one that started the fight, never returned home, only his horse did. And that evening his family went searching for him, and they discovered his body, shortly before sunset, lying by a bridge. He had been stabbed with his own knife. And although Worthy had several enemies, the suspicion immediately fell to Del Kincaid, the teacher. Sheriff Wiley Byrne, a close friend of Worthy's, went to the teacher's house later that night and roused him out of bed to question him. Kincaid denied any knowledge of Worthy's murder, but Boone didn't believe him, especially when the sheriff noticed bloodstains on a shirt that was draped over the chair. "Del, where were you between 6 and 9 p.m.? "Well, after work I went rabbit hunting, and then I came home," the teacher replied. "Where'd you get the bloodstains on your shirt?" "From cleaning the rabbit I caught." "Where's the rabbit?" "I ate it." The sheriff was convinced that Kincaid had committed the crime, but he still didn't have enough evidence until a witness stepped forward. Randall Turnipseed. Remember the student that couldn't stand his teacher, the one that walked in that was always naughty and had to clean the outhouse? Well, he walked into the sheriff's office the next day and said, "I heard about the murder, sir. I know who killed Tom Worthy." "Well, spit it out, boy. Who's the killer?" "Mr. Del Kincaid." "How do you know that?" "Last night I was out coon hunting, and I saw Mr. Kincaid and Mr. Worthy arguing by the bridge. The two began wrestling, and the next thing I knew, Mr. Worthy is sprawled by the side of the road dead." "Why didn't you come forward last night, boy?" "I thought Mr. Kincaid saw me, and I was afraid he might come after me." Sheriff Boone and a deputy marched over to the blacksmith shop where Kincaid was working. "Del," Boone said, "you're under arrest for the murder of Tom Worthy." "I told you I didn't do it." "We have a witness. Now are you going to come peacefully?" "Yeah, I have nothing to hide." Now, nowadays, if you saw blood on something, and we would have it tested, right? And we would try to find the DNA, and that test would tell us if it's a human's blood and which human, or it would tell you if it was an animal's blood. But back then, blood was blood, and they had no idea where that blood came from. So you might be accused of something you didn't do. Kincaid was locked in jail while the sheriff tried to piece together the evidence needed to prove that the teacher was a murderer. Day after day, Sheriff Boone questioned Kincaid, trying to coax a confession, but Kincaid would angrily reply, "I haven't killed anyone, and whoever says I did will have to face the consequences of the truth." A few weeks later, Kincaid was brought to trial, and witnesses described instances when they saw the teacher's temper, which in the excitement of the murder trial became greatly exaggerated. Then his boss and two of his own students described the scene that took place when Tom Worthy knocked Kincaid down. Next, that student, Randall Turnipseed, took the stand. He described in detail how Kincaid had waited for Worthy by the bridge and then ambushed him. In the course of the fight, said the boy, Kincaid grabbed Worthy's knife and stabbed him several times. Some of Randall's testimony did not match the evidence. First, Worthy had only been stabbed one time. For the murder to have happened at 8 p.m., as Randall claimed, Kincaid, who left the blacksmith at 7:30, would have had to gallop his horse for nearly 30 minutes in order to reach the bridge, yet no witnesses saw him gallop out of town. Also, Randall was known to tell tall tales. That means you're not telling the truth. Even though the judge suspected the boy was probably not all that truthful, the testimony was allowed to stand. Finally, Sheriff Boone took the stand and held up the bloody shirt that Kincaid was wearing the night of the murder. "This clinches it for me," he said. "This man is guilty, plain and simple, of murdering my friend who was a decent father and a good husband." After the state presented its case, Kincaid testified on its own behalf. "Yeah, I had words with Tom Worthy the afternoon of his death, and yes, he punched me. But other men in town have traded words and fists with Tom at one time or another. Any one of them could have had a score to settle. And although I disliked the man, I certainly didn't want to see him dead. He gazed around the courtroom and continued. After work, I went rabbit hunting nowhere near where Tom was killed. And then I went home. I did not murder Tom Worthy, and that is the truth. His voice rang full and sharp, and his eyes blazed with fervor. The prosecutor wasn't swayed. In his closing arguments, the attorney faced the men in the jury box. Women were not permitted to serve on juries back then. Gentlemen of the jury, it's obvious who killed Tom Worthy. We have a motive, a man who seeks revenge after being humiliated in front of his own students. We have a witness, a boy who saw the murder with his own eyes, and we have physical evidence, a bloody shirt. Can there be any doubt in your mind who committed this crime? In the name of all that's decent, in the name of the victim, I implore you to find Del Kincaid guilty of murder. The jury took less than an hour to reach its verdict. After the 12 men returned to the courtroom, Kincaid stood at the defendant's table and stared at them. Then he held his breath as the jury foreman said, "We, the jury, find the prisoner, Del Kincaid, guilty of the murder whereof he stands charged." A shudder rippled through Kincaid's massive body, and his lips quivered in disbelief, and members of the audience broke out in shouts, causing the judge to rap his gavel sharply. The judge turned to Kincaid and said, "Have you anything to say before I pronounce your sentencing?" "Yes, Your Honor," said Kincaid, his neck muscles straining from anger. Staring at the faces of the witnesses who testified against him, he bellowed, "I have not killed anybody. Those who say I did are liars. I will haunt this town until each and every liar takes his final breath." And then Kincaid slumped back in his chair. The judge cleared his throat and said, "It is the judgment of this court that the prisoner Del Kincaid be sentenced to death. He is to be remanded to the common jail of this county and there remain until the 21st day of August, whereupon he is taken by Sheriff Boone from the jail to the place of execution between the hours of 10 o'clock in the morning and 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and there be hanged by the neck until dead. It is also the order of the court that all of Del Kincaid's property be sold at auction to help pay for the cost of the trial. Court is adjourned." Kincaid kept shaking his head in protest as he was led away by the deputies to await his doom. Now, this is another really icky part of history, right? So when you were guilty of something back in the old days, they would hang you, which is a horrible way to die. And they would build this stand, a gallows it was called, and people would come with their children and picnic baskets and buggies, and they would watch it like it was a movie or something, and it was a real person. And that's a really terrible time in history. So sometimes when people say, "Oh, things are so much worse today," well, really, they were pretty bad back then. We certainly would not do that nowadays with our families, right? So this was a bad time in history. That is not anything that happens nowadays. On the day of Kincaid's execution, buggies and wagons full of families from neighboring towns and counties began arriving in Rockton. They had come to watch the murderer hang. When Sheriff Boone went to Kincaid's cell to escort him to the gallows, the lawman was surprised at how calm the condemned man acted. "It's time, Del," said the sheriff. "You're not going to give me any trouble today, are you?" "No, Sheriff, I've never given you any cause." "Well, you don't seem as upset as I'd expect a man about to be hanged." "Oh, I'm plenty upset, Sheriff, and I intend to let everyone know that I've been falsely accused." Moments later, Kincaid sat between the sheriff and the deputy in a horse-drawn wagon that slowly rolled through the throng of onlookers. Kincaid remained expressionless, tuning out jeers and comments from the crowd. A few hundred yards ahead in the town square stood the wooden gallows that had been built solely for Kincaid's execution. With his hands tied behind his back, Kincaid was led to the top of the platform. He looked around at the huge crowd that had gathered to see him die, and then he gazed across the street at the red brick schoolhouse, the building that had brought him so much satisfaction as a teacher. It should never have come to this, he thought. I should be in that schoolhouse teaching, not facing my death. I belong in the classroom. How can they do this to me? "Do you have any last words?" the sheriff asked him. "Yes," he said quietly. Turning to the crowd, he said, "I am an innocent man, and my soul will not rest. It shall find a way to prove to this town that I am going blameless to the gallows." Tears trickled down his face, causing his beard to glisten in the hot afternoon sun. Sheriff Boone then placed a black hood over Kincaid's head, slipped the noose around his neck and tightened it, and at exactly 1 p.m., Del Kincaid was hanged. Satisfied that justice had been done, members of the crowd went their separate ways, leaving the town square empty. Randall Turnipseed was one of the last to leave the area, and he watched as the deputies lowered the body of his former teacher and placed it in a horse-drawn wagon. Randall started to walk away when he glanced at the schoolhouse. Suddenly he felt sick to his stomach. He blinked once, And then he, again and again, no, it can't be, he thought. It's just my imagination. There on the south side of the school wall, the one facing the gallows, loomed a mysterious shadow. It was unmistakable. Life-sized, it was the form of a burly, bearded man hanging from a rope by his neck. Randall closed his eyes and rubbed them, and when he opened again, he saw the same eerie scene. Although faint enough that it could easily be missed by passerbys, it was clear enough to anyone who looked at it closely. He walked several yards to his left and then several yards to his right, trying to study the shadow from different angles. But it looked the same no matter where he stood. He grabbed the arm of a friend who had been walking by. Henry, look! What do you see at the window? At the building. Look at the building. Look at the side. The schoolhouse? No, look at the wall, the shadow. Henry gave a whistle and gasped. It looks like the shadow of a hanging, of the hanging. Hey, everybody, look at the shadow on the wall. A murmur spread through the town square, and people spilled out of the stores and buildings, and buggies turned around, and within an hour, the square was once again thick with people buzzing about the strange sight. So even though he was hanged, but his body was taken away, it still shows that on the side of the building, in a shadow. It's a haunting. It's Kincaid, all right. It would take a man as large as him to cast such a big shadow. That's Kincaid getting his revenge on us. No, it's him telling us that he is innocent. Maybe it's an illusion. And as night fell, the shadow disappeared, but to everyone's astonishment, it returned at daybreak and stayed all day. And Sheriff Boone immediately tore down the gallows, but that had no effect on the shadow. In fact, nothing did. It appeared every day, rain or shine, on the side of the brick wall. Men, women, and children from miles around flocked to Rockton to see the bizarre dead man's shadow. Sheriff Boone, the mayor, and many other townspeople were upset and embarrassed by the spectacle. We can't expect our children to attend a school with the shadow of a dead man on it, said the mayor. Volunteers tried to scrub the shadow off the red brick wall, and when they failed, they tried to cover it up with white paint, but the shadow remained. That was crazy. Then they tried painting the wall black, and that did no good. The shadow showed up in a lighter shade of gray. And finally, with the new school year rapidly approaching, officials came up with a solution. They would grow ivy from the homes of several volunteers and cover up the entire brick wall. That way, the dead man's shadow could no longer be seen. I am blown away by the story, Mr. Fisher, said Mike. His hand was shaking so much he couldn't finish his drink. Are you sure that Del Kincaid had a beard? That's what they say. So what happened when you tore down the school? Did you see the shadow? No, we didn't, but you're getting ahead of us. Wait a minute. I'm not done with my story. You see, there's more. You know how kids can be, and even though the ivy covered up the wall, every year or so kids would strip the ivy down and get a glimpse of the shadow, and that went on for years. But then when the kids pulled the ivy down one day back in 1898, the shadow was plumb gone. It had disappeared and it never came back. Why? Said Mike. I'll tell you what I think. Remember Randall Turnipseed, the student who lied? The one whose testimony hung him? It actually made Del Kincaid get hung. Well, after he grew up, he fought in the Spanish-American War in 1898, and he was seriously wounded. He was brought back to Rockton, but he never fully recovered. And on his deathbed, he gave a confession. He said he had never seen Del Kincaid on the bridge. In fact, Randall wasn't anywhere close to the murder scene. He had been mad at his old teacher, and he figured that he was guilty anyway, and so he lied in court. He lied on the stand. He simply got caught up in the excitement of the murder trial. Know what's really odd about this? The same year that Randall died, the shadow disappeared on the side of the schoolhouse wall and it never returned. That's astounding, said Mike. Yeah, but there's a sad note to this story, said Harvey. The Turnipseeds never told the Kincaid family about how Randall had confessed and about how Del had been innocent. What a terrible injustice. So how did you come to know about it? Harvey hemmed and hawed before he replied. Well, Randall Turnipseed, the boy who had lied, he was Todd's great-great-uncle on his mother's side. Mike shook his head in amazement. Now everything is beginning to make sense, he thought. If Todd is connected to the schoolhouse bricks through an ancestor, maybe I am too. Shaking Mr. Fisher's hand, Mike said, Thank you so very much, sir. I've got to run. Where are you going? Into the past, Mr. Fisher, into the past. Mike raced straight to his great-aunt Helen, who was born and raised in Rockton. Although she had never seen the shadow herself, she confirmed the story because she'd heard about it too, and she said her father had been there the day of the hanging. At Mike's request, she showed him the family tree she had put together over the years, and he studied it, but there was no indication of anyone related to Randall or Kincaid or the sheriff. Oh, I thought I had it solved, he said. Aunt Helen reached over and held his hand. Michael, I have something to tell you. The family tree is not complete. There is a name missing, one of our relatives. Who? Del Kincaid, the teacher. He was your great, great, great uncle. He so shamed our family because we thought he had committed murder, and he was disowned by everyone, and so I didn't put his name in the family tree. Mike's head was reeling. I'm related to Del Kincaid after all. That's the missing link. I'm related to Del Kincaid, and Todd is related to Randall Turnipseed. Now I know why Todd Fisher and I have been seeing the vision of the hanged man. The next day, the teacher asked Todd to bring the brick to school before class. Then Mike put the two bricks side by side on his desk and told the boy the story of the dead man's shadow. Todd, I think I have this figured out. We're both having visions of Del Kincaid, the teacher who was put to death on the testimony of Randall Turnipseed. You're related to Randall. I'm related to Del. He was wrongly convicted, and that's why he haunted the schoolhouse with his shadow. Somehow his ghostly energy was revived when you and I, descendants of those involved in the trial, touched these bricks from the schoolhouse. So what do we do now? Said Todd. Let's take our bricks and follow me. They climbed to the top floor of the school and then onto the roof. And when it was clear below, they dropped their bricks and watched them smash onto the concrete below. I'm pretty sure your headaches and those terrible visions won't be back, said the teacher. Just don't touch any more bricks from the old schoolhouse, okay? Okay, Mr. Kerr. He was innocent, you know. That night, Mike paid another visit to his great Aunt Helen. He took out her family tree and he grabbed a pen. It's time we made this family tree more accurate, Mike declared. And then he wrote in the name of Del Kincaid, their innocent relative. Neither Mike nor Todd had those terrible headaches or visions ever again. Dead Man's Shadow.